Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev. All right, so we are back with another episode with Steve Bechtel. And today we're going to be talking about specific strength training for climbing. And so we've done how to train climbing endurance. We've done general strength for climbing, like basically how to build a super strong body for climbers. And now we're going to kind of make that a little bit more of a narrow focus on how to train specifically for climbing, because general strength is very different to specific strength. So that's what we're going to dive in today. Hello, Steve. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm psyched to talk
Awesome.
about this because this is where a lot of people get pretty confused with their training and they get really frustrated. So I'm excited that we get to chat about it today.
Awesome. Yes. And of course, we have Katja here today. Hello, Katja.
Hello, hello. I'm very excited.
Yeah, and I think we do get, I think this is where I get most of my questions actually, is specific strength and kind of like the finger strength is a big component, or at least a big topic of today's podcast. So let's start off. What is really specific strength when we're training it, Steve?
Specific strength is a honing of your general strength. And it's funny, like, Chris Hampton, who's a mutual friend of ours, has one of his taglines is "sharpen your sword," and I like the idea of that, and that really is a good comparison to specific strength, where general strength is actually having a sword to sharpen. You've got to build the sword, you've got to forge the sword, and then you get to sharpen it. And so sharpening something that's not very strong, sharpening something that's not well built in the first place, only gets you so far. And so we really need to build a sword, then sharpen it. And the specific strength is that sharpening. And without the general, it has very limited value.
Mm-hmm. And I am going to throw this curveball in there. I think where I see maybe where a lot of very strong climbers make this mistake is the constant sharpening, where that sharpening actually ends up making that sword super fragile. And so there does have to be kind of like this balance between building that sword and sharpening it, and kind of like going back and forth. Can you talk a little bit about like kind of like how that foundation really does set the stage for sharpening the sword? Like at what point should we start training specifically?
Well, I think that the really critical thing to understand is that if we're spending a lot of time performing, if we're out at the boulders or out at the crag, frequently we're getting a lot of specific training in at that point anyway. A lot of specific strength is happening. And that's sort of how we initially start training for climbing. We go, oh man, my fingers didn't feel strong enough. So between climbing days, I'm going to hang from them and try to make them stronger. Or I got really, really pumped. And so between climbing days, I'm going to do things that make my forearms pumped. That's great. But understanding that that specific adaptation has a real flattening curve as we get better and better and better. And so we want to make sure we step back and go, okay, what are the things that are holding those things back? For example, with general training, a weak antagonist tends to put the brakes on the improvement of a prime mover. The easiest example is if I only do pull-ups and I have no strength in the stabilizers of my shoulders, neurologically, I'm going to be trying to hold that back a little bit to avoid injury. And now it's not super easy to get that situation, but if I am only doing one kind of training and I'm getting an instability there, I'm going to be getting a lot of clues from my body, which include like little bits of pain, little bits of feeling like I've overused my shoulders or things like that. My elbows are hurting. And so if I can do general strength to mitigate those things, and really your general strength is injury reduction training. And if I can do that kind of stuff to make sure that I'm taking the brakes off of my ability to gain specific strength, then my specific strength is more successful. A really good example is general grips training, like squeezing the spring grippers or doing things where you're rotating your wrist or turning your wrist. Those are really great ways of developing overall strength in the forearm that is not just specific to these few angles we use with our fingers. And the more we can develop that kind of stuff, again, the more we injury proof that connective tissue, we build some strength without just being in that same position all the time. And so we can probably, with most athletes, see a reduction in injury if they are just willing to do a little bit of not exactly simulating climbing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess like to me, specific strength really is like that huge neurological piece where you're building that skill to perform. Like, okay, I need these specific edges for my project, and I'm gonna kind of train those specific positions. Yeah, and I know before I became a climbing coach that I was that person that you were just talking about. Like between my projects, I would try to like chase my lowest hanging fruit of like, oh, it must be my fingers. I'm gonna do some like max hangs before my next session outside, and definitely that's gonna work. You
Yeah.
know?
And it does. If you don't get a lot of climbing outside, we do need to have a fair amount of sport specific conditioning. And a lot of people think that climbing inside is the same as climbing outside. We know it's not exactly, but it's close enough that we go, okay, if I boulder inside a whole bunch, that's going to apply better than me going to the weight room and lifting a bunch of weights. However, I've got to build that general athleticism that we talked about in the previous podcast about general strength. And then the higher that level of athleticism, the higher I can push my specific. If we looked at it in terms of, like to call it foundation training, but foundation training, like if I build a gigantic, 100-foot wide, 100-foot deep concrete foundation, I can build anything I want on top of it. If I don't have any foundation, it doesn't matter how sick my specific training building is, it's going to fail because the foundation is too weak. And so when in doubt, I think it's really important to go back and say, okay, what am I avoiding? What parts of my conditioning have I not paid attention to? And it might be whether I can get my arms into the correct position or whether I can hold my body in those correct positions. It could be some core stability stuff. It could be leg strength. But all of those things are not the obvious failure points. And that's why we get trapped into specific training only, because the last thing I always see when I fall off of a problem is my fingers coming off those holds. And I'm like, oh, my fingers were not strong enough. But a video review or talking to my coach about it is like, oh, wow, my position was really bad. My beta was bad. My momentum was bad. And so maybe my finger strength wasn't the only thing, but it's an easy trap to fall into.
Yeah, totally. So actually, let's talk about what buckets can you put specific training into? For example, we have to develop finger strength. So like hangboarding is one example. What are some other drills or like buckets that you tend to train when it comes to specific strength training?
Well, when we look at the movement of bouldering or climbing, it's really kind of cool when you start to break it down physiologically, because you look at the muscle actions, and if I get onto the wall and I grab the holds, I'm holding my fingers in a static position, and then I start to pull. My fingers are still held in a generally isometric or static position, but I'm using this concentric movement with my back muscles. Maybe I'm holding some stability in my stomach, and then I have to do maybe really explosive move, catch another generally static position, even though my fingers might, move a little bit. And then I pull again. So the unloaded portion of our movement is usually, or excuse me, the eccentric portion of our movement is usually unloaded, usually. And then we have to be really tight again, hold these static positions. And there's a lot of very specific things that happen there that can be trained easily on a system board or a campus board or a fixed board. And so I can get on to my kilter board and climb nice and slowly and practice on my lock-offs. I can get on my campus board and practice my explosiveness. I can do specific finger positioning or finger strength in movement, like on a system board. And all of those things are really valid. Those are more specific to climbing than hangboard training. Hangboarding is great because it's a simple setup. It's also really easy to measure. It's also fairly benign when it comes to overloading your entire system. Like you can do a big hangboard session and not be like neurologically wiped out for the whole day. And so, although that's an important tool, I think people can think beyond that. And there's this realm of specific training between like finger strength over on the hangboard over here, and then my limit level project over here. And that specific strength training is really key, and it can happen just by simply trying to do some intentional drill work or intentional exercises, even in a climbing environment.
I know that we'll go a little bit deeper into programming and like when to do this, but it definitely seems like the systems board, any kind of training board stuff, and even maybe the campus board like movement could be done almost year round, because it has this movement component. Do you think so? Like, we're about to have like a coaching call with the folks at Tension Board for our community members on how can new people, new trainees start using the board. Um, and I think you already kind of explained it like fairly simply already. Like it is movement based, but do you have any like simple approaches for people if they want to start using a training board to kind of be a little bit more specific about what they're trying to do on a board, so that they're saying that they're training specifically?
Yeah, well, I think a really interesting thing is when uh, a person thinks that a certain angle has harder grades, or certain hold types, like V3s on slopers are really hard. Well, it's not really that way. The cool thing about the grading on any of these boards is they're fairly consistent across the board. And so if you get on a 60-degree problem and you just cannot even do, V1 on at 60 degrees, but when it's 20 degrees, you can climb V5. That's an indication of somewhere that you need to gain some skills or some strength. The other thing that's really important there is like looking at different rock types, different hold types. Um, can I hold a lock off on a crimp hold? Can I hold a lock off on a sloping hold? And starting to just get a general idea there. Now, the trap that many of us fall into is like, I need a percentage assessment. I need a comparative assessment of how I do on crimps compared to other V10 boulderers. I think that that's also its own big can of worms that we don't want to get into, because it's much simpler than that. Really, if you tend to not perform very well on any specific type of movement, angle, hold type, rock type, that's going to be indicative of probably a skill deficit, but potentially a strength deficit. And so for me, it's a really interesting example. One of the climbs that I do habitually in our winter crag, where I've climbed there for 25 years, has a boulder problem at the beginning that's got a pretty tough couple of lock-offs on some crimps. And I noticed about 4 years ago that problem was feeling harder and harder and harder. And I started to watch videos of it, and I noted that, unfortunately, I didn't have any video from before, but I noted that as I pulled up into that position, I started to reach, this arm started to come away. So then I'm like, okay, I'm not holding that lock off. So going to the gym, can I hold the lock off on a pull-up bar? Yeah, that's pretty easy. Can I hold that size of edge all the way up at a straight arm? Yeah, that's pretty easy. But then when I try to pull down here and I'm holding this position, I'm really, really weak right there. And so the combination of big lock off muscle in my back and fingers, wrist held at this position, was a weakness for me. And so I needed to go and simulate those specific types of things because the parts of it, hanging straight arm on a hangboard or holding a lock off on a pull-up bar, were not doing the trick. And so I can do some adjustments there. I also note that I can't get my feet as high in high step positions as I used to. And so that's one of these specific strength things. You sort of think about it as flexibility, but just, my number one go-to on that, and I've talked to you about it before, is your high step drill with the band, because it is an end range of motion strength thing. That's a very specific strength adaptation. And so I can do those things, like you were saying, kind of throughout the year, but they don't have to be like the only focus of my training. But I can start to take these little buckets and go, what are these few things where I'm noticing myself not performing at the same level that I used to be able to, or that I want to be able to? And how can I address those things? And it doesn't take a lot. It just takes some level of attention to it.
Amazing. Okay. So I think there is maybe a distinction we do need to point out here, because you are mentioning a lot about like hold type, especially if you're an outdoor climber. Even if you're an indoor climber, you can kind of like boil it down to hold type and position specific. It almost seems like there's a one step down from that isn't quite general strength, but it almost bridges the gap between general and specific, which is, for example, like lock off strength on a bar. Like that wouldn't really be classified as like true specific strength, but it is something that we need, and we might not always train it in our general strength training. And I think like I sometimes also get not confused, but like, okay, where does that fit in? Like, how do I make sure that my athlete is getting these things that they're missing or that they're really weak at, by not just throwing them into complete specific strength yet, and making sure that they are developing some of that in their general strength. So I do want to talk about lockoffs because this is a question I get quite a bit. And we can talk about a little bit of an assessment here in a second, and some hangboarding later down the road in this podcast. But with lockoffs, I tend to actually stray away from too much hard locking off on a bar. But I'm really curious on how do you get people started with some lock-off training?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing is to do it in a sports specific environment. So I would love to build specific strength into skill work. A great one is to set a reachy problem that you ask the athlete to do statically. You want to climb slowly through it. And so they have to build feet, really pull down, and then make this reach statically, grab the next thing, build feet, reach statically. Many people have that ability to jump up through those things, sweep through those. But in the spirit of this skill work and of specific strength training, we ask them to slow it down a little bit. One of the other things that I just talked to a guy about yesterday was when he's doing route simulations, and he's noticing that he climbs faster on his home wall than he does on the route. And he's like, so do I just have to pretend to climb really, really slowly? Well, no, but I want you to climb at a normal pace. But every single time that you move your hand, I want you to make 3 foot moves. So you grab the next hold, go left, right, left. Grab this hold, left, right, left. And so because the movement and the footwork indoors is so much easier than it is on the rock, we want to simulate the strength needs for the upper body by artificially changing the goal of what we're doing with our feet. And just moving your feet around requires you to maintain some tension, requires you to take the time to hold those upper body positions. Because then when we're climbing, when we're out on the rock, that specific overload to our fingers changes a little bit. And when I'm holding on to each hold for 5 seconds rather than for 2 seconds, it's a different overload. And that's part of why people have a hard time transitioning from a lot of fixed board climbing to climbing actual boulders. Because you watch the videos of somebody climbing out a moon board, and it takes them 13 seconds to climb to the top of the board. And then they get out to a bouldering trip and they're 25 seconds into a boulder problem and they're not even close to the lip. They're just badly prepared. And that's part of specific strength training too, is moving the body's ability to perform in the performance environment, all the way from our very first movement. And so to go back to your lock off stuff, we do these lock offs, move our feet slowly. It's very rare. I mean, think about it. Like, we almost never have both hands on jugs and have to hold this position. And so a lot of lock off training on a pull-up bar is going to super overload the internal part of the elbow, and it's not going to apply really specifically to what we're doing outside. So I would say on a pull-up bar, the only time I'd really address that would be when you're doing strength related pull-ups, like weighted pull-ups or something like that, just making sure that you get really good range of motion. One of the biggest things that happens for athletes is they kind of get to where they can see over the bar and then they come back down, and then they can see over the bar and then they come back down. I'm kind of exaggerating here, but you see this pull up all the time, right? And so we want our athletes to be able to go full range of motion. Nothing bad happens if we straighten our elbows at the bottom of a pull up, to all the way till our chest or our clavicles touch the bar. If you can't do that range of motion, it would serve you to make sure you can get the range of motion at body weight or at less than body weight with an assist, until you can do that. And then you can start adding load. But getting super duper strong in the short range of motion has very limited value. If I can get to where I'm really strong all the way through here, my lock off training may not need to happen. I can do some core related stuff. I can do some slow movement related stuff. And then my lock off is going to be fine, because I've also learned in my skill work, like I said in this original exercise, starts to get my body to learn to position correctly to hold lock offs well. And I may not need to do it at all. And so what was perceived as a weakness was actually really its skill deficit.
That is awesome. You answered that question exactly how I wanted you to. Thank you so much, Steve. Because yeah, like, again, like, for our community members who are listening to this is why we have slow motion climbing in a lot of our workouts, especially as you're starting training. We definitely do that slow-mo. It really is like the secret sauce to a lot of like strength deficits that tend to pop up in climbing. I know that Katja has a question or a statement.
Yeah, this is really awesome. So first of all, I want to say, if anybody's listening to this but not watching this, go and watch it, because Steve is demonstrating a lot of really cool things on video. And I'm about to demonstrate something too. And I really just want to add this. I love what you said, because I think we often just think about skill work as purely skill. We don't think about the strength component so much. But strength and skill go together. It's like this coordination of muscles, right? And when we practice pull-ups and log-offs on the bar, we can often only go so far in terms of how high we can get our body. But then often, I hope people are watching this, I'm going to try to explain what I'm doing is, but if you're climbing slowly to practice your log-off skills on the wall, what you're finding and learning, and you really need to focus on, is like, keep pushing with that lower hand. So what happens is sometimes we forget about that when we log off. I know I'm making funny things. This is hilarious. But I really want to emphasize, this has just come up with some athletes, is this idea of you need to keep pushing with that lower hand as you're practicing, even your lock-off skills. So if you want to do really extreme lock-offs as you're reaching up, often we actually have to push way lower than we often can practice on the bar. And that's a really important end range that we don't get by just doing general training. And certainly, even when we do dynamic moves, that's a movement we can't forget. That's part of the movement. We often just think about going up, but what is our lower hand doing? It still needs to like push down and pull us and keep us in the wall if we're dead pointing, for example. So this is why I love that you said that, because it really, it trains our body in very, obviously sport specific ways, but even like beyond the gym, of how we could even simulate that movement on the bar.
Yeah.
Except for doing a muscle up. But then again, we wouldn't be able to do that on the wall necessarily. So I thought it was really wonderful. I just wanted to add that and I kind of remind people that there's always this lower hand that's part of climbing as we start focusing on the upper hand when we reach the next hold. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point. And one of the things that I think is fascinating is the change in our finger strength depending on where that edge is. So many of us now have access to like a force board or a 10 deck, and we can do a maximum hang and go like, oh, I can pull 200 pounds. But very, 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 very infrequently do we get like a tiny, tiny hold and just have to do this with it. Usually we have to move our body past it in some way. And so if our arms are straight above our heads and we're loaded on a 20 millimeter edge, and I can pull an extra, double my body weight or something, it means very, very little if I can't do anything else with that hold. So here's a really great exercise. If you have a force board, any kind of strain gauge, is get a maximum strength, pull overhead, and many people get that number anyway. Get another number with your elbow at 90 degrees, and I'm going to pull here. That's probably fairly similar for most people, because we tend to be really strong right in here, right? But when the hand gets below the level of the shoulder, and so your fingers will be below your shoulder, it's really hard for you to keep your wrist straight. And the wrist is really, the stability of the wrist is really fundamental to finger strength. And so as soon as my wrist comes down here, I'm going to be in this position. I'm pulling on a little edge. For me, I can pull around 180 to 200 pounds straight arm up here. It's about the same right here. And down here, it's below 60 pounds. And so when I get down here and I'm really trying to pull and I can't hold that position, I might go, oh man, I need to work on my lock off because I cannot hold that position. But really, it's this structure here is failing to hold at that, because I can only hold 60 pounds. So of course I can't make that next move. And so more training up here and more pull-ups is not going to solve that problem. It's getting my fingers stronger when that wrist is folded back. And if you've ever competed in arm wrestling, which all of us have, of course, the way that you win in arm wrestling is to turn your wrist in and force the opponent to fold their wrist back, because we get really, really weak when we're back here like this. And so when I'm climbing training, especially if I have an athlete that's concerned about their lock off or concerned about their height in comparison to other climbers, I want to know how strong they are down here with those wrists folded back. And maybe the trick is to put a chair underneath your hangboard above your bedroom door and work on your pulling down here and try to get stronger in that compromise position. And that is where specific strength really starts to shine, if I know what to look for.
I'm just going to put a plug in for like end range strength, because you are showing like that full end range in the wrist, full end range almost in the shoulder. We're not going into full extension, but we know at that point there is very little muscle activation there, and you do need to like train that specifically to the angle. That's awesome.
And the easiest place in the world to do that is on an actual climbing wall, rather than trying to simulate it in a gym or something, or pick up a tension block with your wrist folded back or whatever. Just try to do longer reaches and hold those positions lower. Same thing, that skill work of holding the lock off. If you can go and just climb up on the jugs on your wall and you can hold those lock offs, move to the next smaller holds, try that same range of motion, but instead of a big jug, we're going to a big edge, and then we go to small edge, then we go to smaller edge, and you'll start to see that the system starts to fail. And it's not your lat strength, because we know that worked with the jugs and that doesn't change. And so it's all this end range structural strength. And it's something that a lot of us ignore. And then we dismiss it and say, oh, it's because I'm too short, or, I'm not good at lock offs or whatever. But really, it's just quite a simple fix.
Awesome. I do want to go to another exercise that I think people maybe believe that it's so specific to climbing and they will just keep doing it and keep chasing it at the gym are front levers. I used to be this person too. I used to train front levers because I thought, you know what, if I had bigger lats or be able to hold my body up, I'll be able to climb double digit. So with front levers, I know that you have some of like front lever training in your journal strength. But again, like just kind of like tell us a little bit about why we don't need to necessarily chase that position. And do we even need front levers?
Yeah, well, there's a couple interesting things with that. I think it's a fun exercise, and it's one of those ones that's like a landmark, like, oh, I can do this exercise. It's like a muscle up. See, it's another great example. It's I can do a muscle up. I've qualified to this level, or when I can do my first pull up. But you're right. I don't think it's absolutely necessary for performance in climbing. A lot of people think of that front lever position as an ab exercise, but really, if you look at what the body's doing, it's sort of a hanging hip hinge. It's like a upside down deadlift more than anything, because we really do need to create a lot of stability in the back and in the posterior chain in order to hold that position. And there's a ton of shoulder and lat involvement as well. The abdominal portion of it is actually relatively easy. And so we go, okay, that might be useful for keeping our hips in on the wall, but there's so many more applicable exercises that we can do, again, integrated with specific skill work to develop that strength. One of the things that's really cool is like to get on a steep wall, a 40-degree or steeper wall, and let your feet come off the wall, put them back on. Or just pull up and let your feet come slightly away from the wall, but without dropping out into that like big backswing a lot of us get. So I'm going to let my feet come off the hold and then put it right back on. Let my foot come off the hold and put it right back on. And I'm not losing my position, because if I do, and if I swing way out and have to swing back in, that's teaching me a really, really bad skill. Easy to do on jugs, right? You know, if I'm on huge holds, I can swing all over the place. But the worse the holds are, the less body movement my system can take. And as I get into V11, V12, V13, you do not see anyone doing that kind of stuff. And so they've had to unlearn that bad skill that they learned on the juggy wall in their gym when they were a kid. And so that kind of thing, like keeping your feet in and keeping your hips over your feet and weighting your feet on steep terrain, those are way more useful skills than the any of the front lever variations. And so front lever may be fun to play with in a general strength phase. It doesn't have to be a huge focus of it. And then in the specific phase, I would say doing skill work that involves tension and movement on a steep wall. And again, I'm not doing this on hard boulder problems. I'm going up on that wall with the intention of developing a skill and developing strength. So I'm not just doing problems. I'm actually doing sets and reps on that wall.
Awesome. Okay, because I know that you have to jet pretty soon, we need to talk about hangboarding. But I think a lot of this stuff, like the front lever, hangboarding, lock-off strength, are so upper body dominant. And I think a lot of people think that there must be something wrong with their upper body if they are failing. And you've kind of alluded to this, like, you know, especially with the tension in the body and feet coming off, that could be a sign of like something technically is going wrong here. So I do, just before we move on to hangboarding, is there maybe an assessment or something that you think can give people a clue that it might not be your finger strength, it might not be your shoulder strength, you might just be forgetting everything that's happening below the chest, you know, because we know, like, if your technique is spot on, you don't need to have a ton of upper body strength and finger strength.
Yeah, I think that the easiest low-hanging fruit these days is video self-assessment. And the really cool thing about the prevalence of social media and YouTube videos of people bouldering or climbing is that you can watch a video of yourself side by side against somebody else climbing another moonboard problem or a classic at Joe's or whatever, and go, oh, okay, the way I did that was different than the way that person did it. And we can assume that high performers have better technique than low performers. Once in a while, a person will go like, oh, well, how would you know? You're super strong. You don't know the best way to do this. But the real truth is that part of efficiency and economy and movement is having a high level of strength. And so, yes, a V12 boulderer on a V4 probably has a better way of doing the problem than this person that's just breaking into V4. So I think it's worth watching video of yourself. Am I climbing this way other people are? Are my feet coming off where theirs are not? Am I milking holds and having to keep adjusting and adjusting, or can I grab something and stay with it? Do I look smooth and in control and economical? It doesn't take a movement analyst to pick those things out. You can pick it out for yourself. And if you're one of these people that I hate watching video of myself climb, it's probably indicative of the fact that you're not happy with the way that that's happening rather than anything else that might be going on there. What we want to see with that is efficient movement, steady movement through cruxes, precision, all of the things that look great when we watch a great climber move. Aggressiveness, intention, all of the things that you see when you watch World Cup and you're like, oh my gosh, Orion Bertone is amazing. Well, why? What is she doing that I'm not doing? I don't think that I would say probably 9 out of 10 times it's not strength. It's almost always positioning and movement. I do know people that climb into the double digits bouldering that can't hold a single arm lock off. I know people that can climb 514 that can't do pull-ups. And so we want to keep thinking like, what's the mixture of this? Yes, we want to have specific strength, but we don't want to just be like, oh, it must be that strength. Most of us have a pretty good adaptation and finger strength already. And so we want to continue to adapt to that, but doing mega overloads of that is probably of negligible value for most people.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah. So with that, let's talk about hangboarding. Okay. So do you have, I think it was the Beta Angels. I'm not sure which app it is, but they have been putting together data on like how much a person can hang from a 20 mil edge, and kind of correlate that to climbing grade. And I'm so glad that you said that, like, there are people out there who climb double digits and who can't do lockoffs, or people who climb 514 who can't do pull-ups, and I know those people too. And just know that you don't have to be monstrously strong in order to climb these grades. However, there is correlation. We know that stronger fingers are going to help you. We know that stronger shoulders are going to help you. Do you have any or what are your thoughts on correlation and like how much people can hang for a certain grade?
Yeah, I think that that's bullshit. And the reason I do is because in practice, we see that, yeah, those generally rock climbers are stronger than average people. But to give you an example, there's interesting study that comes out that shows people with stronger grip tend to have greater longevity. And it's a pretty well established study. It's been repeated. And what it indicates is that these people are more athletic, they're more movement oriented, and they tend to be more active on a day-to-day basis than people that are sedentary. And so the sedentary people tend to have shorter lifespans. The reaction to that is a whole bunch of people going to the gym and going to coaches and saying, hey, can you help me get my fingers and my hands stronger? I want to increase my grip so my longevity increases. But it's a result of athleticism rather than like, wow, if I have super strong fingers, I'm going to live forever. And the same thing happens with climbers is yes, really good rock climbers tend to have very, very strong fingers. But there are a lot of people with super strong fingers that just suck at rock climbing. And there are even people that have these outrageous high numbers on specific climbing tests, the 20 mil straight arm pole, but they're not climbing at those same high grades. And so I think it's really important to not chase that specific thing and look more intently on, am I weak in this lower position? How am I on side pulls? Can I hold Gastones? And if there's certain kinds of problems, again, going back to the first stuff we talked about, certain kinds of problems that I really suffer with, I've got to start breaking down why that is. And it's almost never just pure finger strength. The hangboard's a beautiful tool, and it's also a giant target for science because it's super simple, but it's just one exercise, just one tool of hundreds that we have to help ourselves improve in climbing. I think it's a really simple way to develop some finger strength, but most people are probably, if they do it at all, they're probably 80% to their maximum strength anyway. And I guarantee there's something that's holding them back other than their finger strength. There is very rare climber that I see that I'm like, whoa, that person needs to get stronger. A couple of years ago at the Climb Strong training camp, we did some testing. We did a general battery of tests with all of the participants and all of the coaches. And one of the people that we had instructing there was Jonathan Segrist. We took everybody's numbers, and they all had a sheet of paper with that data on it, max pull-ups, their max force. We had about 6 or 7 data points. And I made this point that if we just mixed up all of those sheets and took the names off of the top of them, we couldn't tell which one was Jonathan, even though he was far and away the best climber there. He wasn't profoundly stronger, even adjusted for body weight, than our 5'11" and 5'12" climbers. And so I think that the really important thing is like trying to intend on becoming so technically proficient that you are the weakest person that can climb the grade that you can climb. And if you look at some of that elite level data that you can look at with like the top climbers in the world, Jonathan is for sure and proudly one of the weaker people that can climb at that level. That's a much better problem to have than being super duper strong and having shitty footwork, because changing the way you technically climb is much more difficult than just adding a little bit of strength.
I loved all the things you just said, Steve. I want to follow up with just 2 things to add to that, because I think I have to be a little bit careful with time here, right, Mercedes? Anyway, love what you said, all of these things. Thank you for reminding us. I want to share one story, which is I talked to Stephen Dimmitt once about, I think, Jonathan Segrist or another wicked strong climber who he climbed with. And he just kept saying that he's just so strong. He's just so strong. And I asked Stephen, I'm like, well, but if you went to the gym with him, do you think he would be so much stronger than you are? Or are you just using the word strong when what you mean is actually he's very skilled? And it kind of just really spoke to what you are saying. And I want to just emphasize this right here. We use the word strength or strong. Someone is a strong climber very sloppily. Because some people who are strong climbers, they might be physically strong and the metrics that we can assess at the gym. But some people are just very good climbers. So they look like strong climbers. But what they really are, they're just very skilled climbers. So their relative strength might be less, even though they're very strong climbers. And so I think we get this a lot in the language when we say, these are strong climbers, and then we think we all need to be physically stronger. I actually have an athlete who was told by a PT once that he has really weak fingers, and he came back to me and he's like, we need to do finger strength. And I was like, yeah, we can do finger strength. You could absolutely use this, but that's a compliment because you've been climbing all these grades because you know how to climb.
Yeah.
And you're not using your fingers too much.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And like I said, like having an actual weakness of like, oh, I just cannot hold a specific position or hold type. Great, easy to address. Strength training is really, really simple to implement. But I think you're right. Like a cow is really strong. Like it can pull a wagon, but I would rather be a tiger who's probably can't pull a wagon as well as a cow. but as very, very skilled and very, very good at using their body and can do amazing things. Nobody's like watching a cow walk through a field going, whoa, look at that thing, you know? So I think you got a good point there.
Yeah, I love this. Thank you for that too. And the second thing I wanted to share, I don't know if you read this, but Carly Raker and Casey Elliott from Project Direct Coaching, they did this analysis on the different metrics that one needs in order to become a better climbing. This is for outdoor climbing specifically. So they took over 600 climbers. They're both engineers, and they did the very data-driven analysis of this. Maybe we can share this in the link in the show notes below, because I think it's a really good analysis, and they use really careful language to not overanalyze the metrics, which I think is really wonderful. So I really love, they did an amazing job, and so shout out to them. And the number one metric that they found correlates with improving or getting better or becoming a good outdoor climbing is climbing outdoor. That was the highest correlative factor for getting better at climbing outside. But they also found that, some other metrics do matter to a certain degree. There's some finger strength in there, some upper body strength, but they did a really good job. Because I think there's a lot of analyses out there right now that are very, very just correlative without actually looking at the data. So they're just based on assumptions. And so I think it's really worthwhile for anybody who is interested in actual data to look at that article that they wrote for Climbing Magazine.
Yeah. And it's funny because like the best science, you kind of go, oh, of course I knew that, right? Like, could you imagine, like if we were talking about surfing, and we're like, oh, like what we really need to do for surfing is increase our foot strength, and we need to spend a lot of time on a slack line. I don't know anything about surfing, but if we broke it apart into all the pieces, we could do a lot of things that didn't have anything to do with standing on a surfboard on a wave in the ocean. But really, I bet the best surfers are the ones that spend a lot of time on waves, right? And so that's a big key. And I said one time that if you're not climbing, if you're not out there doing 15 to 20 pitches a week, you probably don't need to be doing a ton of training. Like you really need to be doing more practice. You need to figure out how to get more climbing in. And I know that gym climbing and living in an urban place and all these things make it hard to get out and get to the rock. But I think that actually doing things, living in the performance environment for a big part of your training time, it is the biggest key to performance improvement. And so then when we talk about like specific strength or general strength or whatever, how does that all fall into our yearly cycle? And that becomes a really important consideration, but we have this trap and that we can fall into where I just need to be building the pieces of this. I just always need to be training to get slightly stronger fingers. And that I think is where many of us fail, because we don't ever go out and apply it and learn how to use it in that environment.
Yeah, that is wonderful. That reminds me, one time I talked to Tyson Shaney. He coaches at Vertical World. He's produced a lot of amazing climbers. I know Mercedes has worked with him. I know Mercedes did some strength work with the kiddos, but I asked Tyson once, what is your secret to, producing these amazing athletes for your training, as he was training these youth athletes? And he said right away, he's like, time on the wall. He's like, as soon as they get off the wall, I send them right back onto the wall. He was just all about repetition on the wall, on the wall, on the wall, versus doing any of the what we call strength specific. I mean, in some ways, that's like the most specific way of training, right? Is being on the wall.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny that it falls away for people and they're like, oh, I need to be building more of the pieces of it. But the fastest way, I'll tell you, and it's still, even I've climbed for a long time now, 30 years or more. And when I get climbing more, get a few more days in a week or add another pitch at the end of the day, things just start to click. And I can go through a training cycle, 16 weeks, and be like, God, I'm still not, these numbers are not where I want them. They're not where I want them. But then 2 weeks of a climbing trip and I'm like, man, I'm climbing great. This is awesome. I love it. And so it is important to make sure that your athletes are getting to enjoy that time and to actually, as a coach, the number one thing is I really think you can improve, and I think I know how to help you improve. Many of us get that feedback from ourselves is like, you will never get better and you don't know how to get better. And so when we have a coach, we have an outside influence, there's always a way. And it's almost always like a simpler solution than you would like to implement. And, it may be as simple as showing up, awake and recovered. I just spent the last week climbing down in St. George with a 17-year-old climber, friend of ours. And he's a great climber, really fun kid. He's way stronger than I am. And he stays up till midnight. And he, eats a whole bunch of candy for breakfast. And he does this and this and this. And then he feels terrible. Like we went to the crag and he was sleeping at the base of the crag and feeling terrible all day. And I was out climbing him, and it should not happen. But it's just those simple interventions of like, let's go to sleep a little earlier, let's eat a good breakfast, and all of a sudden he's, can't be stopped. And so it is sometimes simpler than we think it has to be.
Oh man, I think this can open up a can of worms too, because there is that camp of people who are like, you just need to climb more. And I think there's like the folks who are really comfortable and they climb but they never see any improvement. They climb a lot and never see any improvement, And then there's the people on the other side that you're kind of talking about, where they're chasing too many numbers. They kind of have this vision in their head that this is what they're supposed to look like and perform at, and like they're chasing too much of that and just not climbing enough. And so I think there is this kind of like fine balance of having fun, getting on the rock that you need to maybe be performing on, because I think it'd be cool to do maybe a podcast on how to prepare for multiple trips around the country, like, because like I find that really difficult. But yeah, I think that you do have to find a balance. At least that's what I found with specific people. They kind of fall into one of those two camps, and you have to kind of bring them into the middle a little bit.
Well, that brings up a really interesting point, Mercedes, and the just climb. Like, you just need to climb more. It worked, right? That's exactly what worked. And we got that feedback the first 2 or 3 years. All of us climbed. It was just like, yeah, I just need to get into the gym more. I need to go to the crag more. And all of a sudden, like my first day climbing to my second day climbing, I went up like 2 grades. I was like, oh, okay. Now, like, day after tomorrow, I'm going to go up 2 more grades. But what happens is we start to level off, and then we have to start looking at the specific, how we can continue to overload. We adapt really well. And what's real interesting about many climbers that climb all the time and can't improve, which is one of the common complaints you get when you hire a coach. Like when people finally decide to join one of your groups or hire you as coaches, it's because they've already tried everything. They did everything they thought they could figure out to do. And they're like, fine, to hell with it. I'm going to hire somebody because I am at a loss. What they're at a loss with, what's not happening for them, is their ability to overload, to adapt to an overload. If I always go out and climb in the same sector of the same crag, or always go on the same bouldering circuit, I'm going to adapt to that specific thing. And if I don't continue to find a way to overload my system and ask my body to adapt, yes, I'm going to quit improving. Really interestingly, if you have somebody that runs like through the park on the same loop all the time, and they do the same 45-minute loop, a couple of things happen. Is one, they get to where they are burning fewer calories per time because they're getting more economical, and so the workout gets less valuable to them. 2 is they'll get faster and they'll go, oh, I'm awesome. This is really, really good. But they may still only be doing the same amount of work. And so that athlete, unless they try to increase their pace, over time methodically, or unless they try to change the duration or type of overload, they're going to really plateau. And so that's part of these progressive running programs, more miles, faster, all that kind of stuff. And it's important that we do that at the crag or at the boulders. What's my plan at the crag today? I am going to do this. I'm going to try all my normal routes, and then I'm going to try to top rope one thing that's a little bit harder. or I'm going to try to lead this thing, or I'm going to try to stretch my system in this way. But many of us are very organized in the gym, and then at the crag, we're just like, oh, I'll just climb whatever my friends are climbing. So one of the most critical tactical things you can do is to make a crag plan and share it with your partner. Lots of times we'll get out there and we'll be like, you get out to the boulder you wanted to try, and there's a bunch of people there, and you're like, I'm going to change my plan. I don't want to do this. I'm nervous. And if your partner is there and you said, hey, wait a second, you said you wanted to try this thing, let's hang out and get into the rotation here and see what happens. It's going to help you overload and adapt and do these things. But given our natural tendencies towards being conservative, nervous, all these sorts of things that we have come up with climbers over and over, if we're not overloading, if we're just climbing and we climb a bunch and we're not getting better, it's because we're not overloading the system. And that's a really key component to making sure that your athlete moves forward, especially if we're not overloading them in the gym as well. If that person doesn't go to the gym or doesn't strength train at all, there's a really good chance that they're going to find this level, spend so much time there that they trick themselves into thinking that that's fixed, that's their genetic potential. And that's not really true.
Awesome. Okay, so we have about maybe 10 minutes. I do want to make sure that we get some of these hangboarding things in. It's so funny because we are actually like completely avoiding hangboarding, which is great for good reason. But let's just do some rapid fire stuff. But if you do want to know more about like specific hangboarding protocols that Steve recommends, like he has a lot of really great articles on his website, and he has a membership. So, you can get that information and it's out there. But let's talk about what is the function of a hangboard? Why are we training on this thing?
Yeah, so the hangboard's a real simple tool, and it's beautiful because it's really compact, and it focuses really carefully on one thing, which is static finger strength. And if we train carefully, we can train some open hand positions, some half crimp, and even some closed crimp positions on it. We can do pull-ups on it, all those sorts of things. But understanding that for the most part, hangboard protocols are designed around holding straight arm static positions. And the limitation there is not like doing 15 different hold types with my hands in this position. Where I really am going to see the most improvement is changing arm angle, changing the hold type, changing the duration that I'm holding, and changing the frequency of how often I do that stuff. One of the most important things is you can do a lot less hangboarding than you think and still see improvements. I think a really key consideration to anybody that hangboards regularly is to do as little as possible to maintain those same numbers. Like go in there, test your max strength, get your numbers on any specific hold, and then try to improve that maybe by 3 to 5% over the course of a training cycle, with the understanding that you cannot continue to improve if you just keep after this thing. That those adaptations really do start to level off. So 3 to 5% gain, and then try to maintain it for several months. Then go back, try to get a 3 to 5% gain, and then try to maintain it. What we do is we go, I want to try to gain 10%. I'm going to push so hard until my finger goes pop. And then I'm going to take 6 months off, and then I'm going to start doing the same thing over again. Most of us don't adapt at the same rate that we originally did in the first few weeks of a program. And so then we go, oh, my program must suck. I need to increase overload. But really, that's just your body leveling off in that adaptation. We can only biologically adapt to an overload so far before we get to a stressor that's too much. The best example for that is like tanning. Like I can go from being very pale to very tan, but like if I double down on it, I'm not going to keep going into like different color patterns. I'm eventually going to level off. And that's the same thing that happens with strength training, with aerobic training, with everything. And so the key is 3 to 5% gain, and then try to hold on to that with as little training as possible. Maybe you come back and test every couple of weeks. Am I still pretty strong there? Okay, that's great. But chasing that instead of chasing being a better climber is a mistake.
Mhm. Okay. That was really good. Like you're focusing in on like strength building. But what's really interesting is that most of my one-on-ones I feel like that I work with have at some point maybe just come off of a protocol that is the 7-3 repeater.
Mhm.
What is that about?
Well, the 7-3 repeater can build strength for people. But by the nature of the work to rest cycle, is really a bodybuilding or a power endurance program, right? 7 seconds on with only 3 seconds of rest doesn't allow recuperation of ATP, doesn't allow full reloading of the strength in the muscle. And so on the very far other end of that would be like, Eric Horst has a program that's, I think, like 5 seconds on, 55 seconds off, which is way better for building strength. But most people can't sit there for 55 seconds. And if they do sit there for that long, they end up getting on their phone and then they're like, oh, I forgot to get back on the hangboard, right? And so somewhere in between is probably a sweet spot for that. And if we want to get strong, we want to be in that 3 to 5 second load, with probably 3 to 5 times as much recovery. So maybe 5 seconds on, 20 seconds off, or something like that might be optimal for a lot of people. If you haven't been doing a lot of hangboarding, that won't feel hard. And that's the thing with the 7-3 that's so attractive, is like, whoa, my hands are tired. I'm really pumped. I'm sweating. I must have trained well. But that's not an ideal strength program. It's actually hilariously enough, yeah, hilariously enough, it's based on a set and rep scheme, or a work to rest ratio of bodybuilding, and was originally designed as a hypertrophy training program within hangboarding, like trying to build more mass in the forearms. And yeah, maybe you can gain some strength and get some mass there. The thing is that's a lot of time, and especially the popular 7-3 programs, they're more than an hour of training on the hangboard. And I think that most people can get strong on the hangboard in less than 10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes 2 times a week, about right.
Yeah. Awesome. Because I do think people, like you just said it, like people are really naturally attracted to things that make them feel like they did something really hard, that they're suffering and good things are going to come out of it. And you had mentioned earlier in this podcast that, hangboarding generally doesn't fatigue the system because it is local. It's like, it is more like tendon building, muscle building. But in this protocol, like a 7-3 protocol, we are building, like we've got waste products building in, and so that can actually affect the system. And so it is so much harder to recover from as well. So it's definitely like those kinds of protocols I feel like I never prescribe anymore, like for years now, because it does seem to have this ripple effect in the rest of their training.
Yeah. It reminds me of like ab training. Like some people are just obsessed with training the rectus abdominis muscle. And the rectus abdominis is really only a prime mover for one movement in your body, and that's 15 degrees of flexion at the trunk, right? So it's the crunch movement. That's the prime mover. But the rectus abdominis is an endurance-based stability muscle. And that need to just keep hammering against that thing is like, oh, it's going to get rid of some of the fat on my belly. If I do enough of them, my rectus abdominis will start looking bumpier. But it takes so much training to overload that muscle and to change the shape of it. And it takes even more training in order to change the amount of fat that's on your abs. There was like it's probably like University of Connecticut or something, and I don't remember the exact study, but the funny number was it was 700 crunches a day for a year to lose 1 pound of fat, right? And so that's just indicative of the small systemic load that the abs have, which is similar to what's happening in the forearms. We're really over focusing on one thing that is probably only a very small piece of performance. Like probably going out for a walk is better for your abs overall. And probably just going out and climbing a little bit is way better than spending hours and hours and hours on the hangboard.
Awesome. Let's talk about safety on a hangboard. I've known quite a few people who have hurt themselves from hangboarding or have some finger issues after a hangboarding session. Do you have any tricks or like words of wisdom on how to make sure that the intensity that you're going for is correct and that people be as safe as possible?
Yeah, I think it's really, like that need to chase the number, and having more and more load is really dangerous because they're probably working close to 95% of our max strength when we're really pushing like a max hangs program. And the funny thing is with isometrics, is that you have a really wide range of possible overload in order to get stronger. And that overload starts at around 65 to 70% of your max. And so if I'm training at 70% of my max, the chance of injury is very, very low. And I'm still going to see those numbers go up. And so again, what I would do is to challenge an athlete to back off a little bit and test and make sure you're seeing those numbers and understand that going 5% harder and 5% harder and 5% harder is not going to increase your strength on a linear scale in the same direction. And so it's probably safer to stay closer to that 70%. A better example is Emil Abramson's famous YouTube video of the no hangs protocol, where he was way below 70% and still saw gains in his finger strength. Right. And so we know that Emil's a great climber and that he does a lot of hard bouldering, does a lot of other stuff as well as that. But the example still rings true that we don't need to be pushing against the absolute limit in order to gain some strength. And the number one goal of training is to prevent injury. The second goal of hangboarding or any other training is to improve performance. But if we don't prevent injury, then we're not ever able to spend our time in the performance environment. And that is a crime. I mean, you should never get hurt hanging on a hangboard.
Yeah, I think when I came up with some of these questions, I have like a vision in mind of a guy. This person is a friend of mine. They're probably not listening to this podcast. But he would go to the gym every time and just be busting out of his face doing hangboard training. Like it was the most intense effort in the gym, at that point in time. And, I always thought like, what if you tried that hard while you're climbing instead,
Yep.
And it just like, I think he did end up having a lot of finger injuries. But like that, I think that is really the take home here is like, these are just tools to help you get a little bit stronger. And just coming back to climbing and having fun and making it specific to some of your projects. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then when we look at the whole spectrum of it, your general strength gets you to this position where you're like able to have the work capacity to spend time on the hangboard or on the system board or whatever. And once you have that capacity, and that usually takes a couple months for an athlete to build up, then we can spend a little bit of time building specific strength, but we don't need a protracted, huge months-long effort at this. We'd spend a month or 2 months building specific strength, and then we want to perform. I really want the athlete to spend as much time climbing their best as they can, and then you can maintain specific strength on once every 10 to 14 days probably. And so then that can go back and it can kind of simmer in the background. And most of my time is just going to be out there having fun with my friends, trying to do hard things and not keeping track too much of like progressive strength increases. In season, we just want to hold on to that strength. Remember, we gained 3 to 5% as we went through our specific phase. Then I just want to hang on to that. The most important thing is to not let that drop off. And that's really common with route climbers is they'll let that drop off. And then we just perform through the season. When things start to slow down, weather changes, or I'm starting to get some achy shoulders or whatever, everybody's seasons end. Then we can go back, restore a little bit, go back and do some more general strength. And like a really good program, I think, would be like to do general strength in the middle of the winter and general strength in the middle of the summer, and then a little bit of specific strength on the tail end of each of those, and then perform for 3 to 4 months in between.
Awesome. Yeah, we're going to go pretty deep into some programming at some point, kind of closer to the end of the series, but Steve's got to go. And so I want to say thank you so much, Steve, again, for awesome information, keeping people safe, healthy, and having fun. All right. Well, we'll catch you in the next one, Steve.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks, you guys.